I heard him curse something about insolence and move ahead down the path, detonating plant bulks with his shots. "Why doesn't the bastard listen?" Midas complained, sighting his Glavian rifle and decapitating a heretic trooper at 100 meters. "Close up," I ordered. "Yarus, frag them!" Yarus and 3 others began to lob frag grenades over the thickets. Explosive flashes blew water ooze and vegetable matter up from the tanks, and the air became foggy with plant fiber and sappy moisture. There was an abrupt change in tone in the enemy fire. The boom of a bolter rang out over the crack and snipe of the laser weapons. I looked down the silver path in time to see Gilad jerk backwards as multiple bolter rounds struck his chest plate. With a cry of rage rather than pain, he went over, off the path, into the bubbling water of the tank behind us, and vanished. Thrusting the heretic foot soldiers out of the way, his killer came down the pathway towards us. "Oh no," Beckwith cried. "Please, by the Golden Throne, no!" Another of the Emperor's children, the brother, if not the twin, of foul Mandragore. His scintillating cloak blew out behind him, and his steel-shod hooves shook the path. He was bellowing like a bull auroch. His bolter spat, and the Gudronite beside me burst apart. The children of the Emperor, shadowy sponsors of this entire enterprise, were here to protect their investment. Had they come unbidden after Mandragore's death? Had Datso or Locke summoned them? I fired the bolter at him, joining the fusillade of desperate weapons blasts that Purge 2 leveled in a frantic attempt to slow him down. Fear made the men forget the best of their training, and many of the shots were wild. He didn't seem to feel those few that struck his armor. "Purge 2! This is Purge 2! The children of the Emperor are here!" I yelled into my box. I knew I would be dead in an instant. It was imperative that Fleet Command knew of this dire development. A black shape burst up from the dark water, cascading froth and ooze in all directions. Brother Gila slammed into the Chaos Marine, wrenching him over, and they both fell thrashing into the adjacent tank. Something, probably the heretic's bolter, fired repeatedly underwater, and the side of the tank below the floating path splintered out in a rush of liquid. The soupy water flooded out, draining away into the gullies between the garden structures. As the fluid level dropped, the titanic combatants emerged, blackened with mire, wrestling and trading inhuman blows among the tangled roots and feeder tube of the tank's murky bottom. Ceramite cased fists pounded into armor plates. Chips of plastic flew from the impact. The Chaos Marine's vast paws clawed at Gila, tearing at his visor and shoulder guards. Gila drove him backward, his feet churning in the shallow, thick water. They slammed in the bowl of a cycad. The enemy grappled, getting a better grip, stabbing a jagged gauntlet spike through the armpit seal of the Death Watchers in Karata armor. Gila staggered, and as he fell back, a massive backhanded slap knocked him over and tore his helmet off. The Chaos Marine landed on the sprawling Gila, tearing at his throat, driving fists like boulders into his face. There was a bang of weapon discharge and a flash. His face destroyed, and his collapsed skull burning from the inside. The chaos filth fell back into the swamp water. Gila rose unsteady, his storm bolter in his hand, blood pouring from the wounds in his face and neck. It was a formidable victory. Yarus and his men cheered and whooped, and then renewed their advance on the remaining heretics. The enemy, resolve lost, pulled back and vanished into the dense thickets of the gardens. Dripping, Gila climbed back onto the path and looked down at me. "I'm glad you're still with us, Brother Gila," I said. We traced the paths on through the gardens of the Ceruthi, unopposed. The enemy dead we passed, floating in the tanks or sprawled on the pathways, had signs of branding on their faces. Chaos marks, burned into the skin by evil rather than heat. Admiral Spatian had hoped that some of the heretic forces, especially the Gudronite Imperial Guard, might yet be restored to the Imperial cause. Like Yarus and his men, most had been unwilling pawns caught up in Estrom's treason, and the fleet tacticians had presented models of victory wherein Locke and Datso found the bulk of their ground forces turning against them. Such a hope was dashed. The minds of these good men had been burned away and poisoned by chaos. The heretics had enforced the loyalty of their stolen armies. Via tetragates we advanced, passing through 6 more garden spheres, then on into wide, tiled courtyards and halls of asymmetrical pillars whose function we could not imagine. Twice we had brief skirmishes with heretic forces, driving them back into the warped cavities of the edifice. More often we could hear ferocious war, full-blown battles that seemed right at hand, but of which there was no visual or physical trace. Contact with Fleet Command was fragmentary. Purge 1, Lord Rawkin's party, was locked in combat somewhere, and nothing had been heard of Molitor's Purge 4. Chongard's group, Purge 5, was lost somewhere in the Tetrascape. Plaintive calls for aid came from them at irregular intervals, piteous half-sane ramblings about impossible spaces and spirals of madness. From Titus Endor we heard nothing. The main surface war still raged. Mayapwa commanders reported gains along the fire legs that edged the target edifices, one of which was reportedly beginning to implode, as if great harm had been done to it internally. In a vault of smooth, polished beige that seemed to us to have no ceiling, we found our first Saruthi. They were dead, a dozen of them, their grey bulk split and mauled, silver stilts torn off. Through the next gate lay a spiral room littered with 100 more. Moving among the grey dead, their pallid limbs dripping with ichor, were several of the white slave beasts that had carried the Necrochuk onto the plateau. They seemed to me to have broken free, as many dragged their wire restraints. Some had taken up silver stilts and were stabbing them slowly and repeatedly into the corpses of their grey masters. I wondered if the pitiful white things were a separate race, enslaved by the Saruthi, or a bastardized mutant caste kept in servitude. The invasion, it seemed, had freed them to turn on their owners and butcher them. Such is the price of slavery, sooner or later. The slave things offered us no threat. They didn't even appear to notice the humans moving amongst them. With silent, methodical determination, they mutilated the bodies of the Saruthi. In another chamber, an oval dish with tessellated tiles and a strangely warm atmosphere, living Saruthi milled aimlessly in their hundreds. Some had lost stilts and were limping. Others lay in trembling masses, their skulls flopped back on their bodies. The smell of licorice, or whatever it was, reeked here. As we watched, white slave things lumbered into the chamber through another tetragate and began to twist apart and maul the Saruthi, one by one, with the calm, methodical motions of insects. The Saruthi offered no resistance. This story was repeated in other chambers and curving halls. Saruthi lay dead or meandering without purpose, freed slaves finding them by touch and dismembering them. I wonder, even now, as to the meaning of these alien scenes. Had the Saruthi given up, resigned to their doom, or had some other circumstance stolen their will to live and resist? Not even the tech priests or the xenobiologists could provide an answer. There is, ultimately, only the fact of their alien nature, abstract, inscrutable, and beyond the capacity of the human mind to fathom. When we found the archpriest Datso, he was close to death. A battle of titanic proportions had taken place in the Tetrascape where he lay. Thousands of dead lay on the tiled floor, Mayapwa infantry and heretic troops alike. 2 children of the Emperor and 3 Death Watch were among the fallen. The Tetrascape, by far the largest of any we had seen in the edifice, reached away beyond the curve of all human dimensions, and the jumbled corpses covered the endless floor into infinity. Datso lay at the foot of an asymmetrical block that rose from the tiles like a standing stone. His body was torn by gunshot wounds. Haldane sat nearby, his back to the great block, guarding the archpriest with an auto-pistol. Haldane's torso was smirched in blood, and his breathing was laboured. He saw us approach through the tetragate and lowered the gun weakly. "What happened here, Haldane?"
"A battle," he said, wheezing. "We came upon it as it was raging. When Inquisitor Ender saw this wretch, he drove us into the fight to reach him. It was a blur after that."
"Where's Endor?" I asked, looking around, hoping I would not see his corpse among the dead.
"Gone. Gone after Locke."
"Which way?" He pointed weakly to a tetragate on the far side of the sea of bodies. "Does Locke have the Necrochuk? The Saruthi Necrochuk, I mean."
"No,"
Haldane said.
"but he has the primer."
"The what?"
"Datso got it out of this thing somehow,"
he said, slapping the stone block that supported him.
"A language primer. A translation tool. Without it, the Saruthi version of the text is unreadable to us."
"How in the Emperor's name did he do that?" Gilar asked.
With his mind,
Haldane said.
Can't you feel that afterburn of the psychic effort?
I found that I could. The mental taste of a mind almost burned out. The raised block was clearly another part of the Ceruthi's mysterious technology, perhaps the equivalent of an imperial cogitator, perhaps something more sentient, even something alive. Datso, whose psychic abilities I already knew to be monstrous, had identified it and psychically assaulted it, forcing it to give up its secrets. An extraordinary feat of the mind, a triumph of will.
A polyhedron,
Haldane added.
Irregular, small, made of pearl, it seemed to me. It just came out of the block into his hands. Materialized. I saw it happening as I fought my way to them. But the effort destroyed his mind. Endor cut him down. He hadn't the strength to resist.
How do you know it was this primer? Asked Bequin.
I read it in his dying mind. Like I said, there is no resistance left there. See for yourself.
I crossed over to Datso and knelt next to him. Ragged breathing sucked in and out of his bloody mouth. I drove my mind into his, pushing aside pathetic strands of denial, and confirmed Haldane's story. With inhuman willpower, Datso had wrenched the language primer from the Ceruthi technology, and with it the whereabouts of the Xenos Necrochuk. Dying, he had passed both to Locke to finish the task. "Gregor," Midas hissed. I turned. Far away, across the curve of the tetrascape, heretic troops were advancing through the dead. They began firing at us. Gilar and the Gudrunites fired back, taking what cover they could to resist. "Brother Gilar, I need you to hold these bastards at bay." "Where are you going, Inquisitor?" he asked, sliding a fresh clip into his storm bolter. "After Locke and Endor, to do what I can." Chapter 25. Xenos Necrochuk. Endgame. The Blank-Eyed Man. We left the firefight behind us and plunged through the Tetragate. Bequin, Midas, and I, racing as fast as we could through the disorienting spirals and imbricating segments of the dying Ceruthi edifice. As we ran, I reported the situation to Fleet Command, but had no reply or way of knowing if they'd understood me. Then I tried Titus Endor, but the Vox was dead. Moving at speed, the place became even more of a four-dimensional maze, but I had in my mind now the engram I had taken from Datso, the memory trace of the route to the Xenos Necrochuk he had ripped from the block. By my estimation, and it could hardly be trusted, we were approaching the heart of the edifice. Perhaps not the physical or geographic heart, but that part of the dimensional construct buried most deeply in the interlocking lamina of warped space and time. There were more Ceruthi here, skittering and clicking around on their silver limb braces without purpose or response. The smell of licorice filled the warm, glowing tunnels and tiled chambers. We heard screaming ahead of us, and the thump of gunfire. "Titus! Titus! It's Eisenhorn! Do you read?" The Vox coughed into life. "Gregor, for the love of the Emperor! I need—" It broke again. More shots. We hurried through a tetragate and almost at once had to dive for cover as las fire flurried around us. The chamber we had entered was by no means the largest we had found in the place, but it was singular. Dark and gloomy, it lacked the radiance that shone from the walls and floors elsewhere. The lustrous material that composed the rest of the edifice was here grey and dissected, as if dead. Another block, like the one Haldane had been propped up against, but many times the size, rose from the ashy floor, streaked with oily greenish matter that ran down its flanks and pooled at the base. An asymmetrical shelf jutted from it, just above the height of an average human, and a blue octahedron sat upon it, glowing internally. The Xenos Necrochuk. Datso's engram immediately confirmed it. The chamber stank with its evil, the licorice smell, so rich and cloying it made us gag. Behind and above the main pillar, warped sculptures of metal, bone, and other organic materials grew from the walls and curving roof. Vicious hooks on filthy chains dangled from these outgrowths. This was not Ceruthi handiwork, but a touch of pure chaos, spawned by the Necrochuk, infecting the Xenos fabric of its sanctum. Smaller pillars, irregular and unmatched, dotted the floor around the main block. In between them, A gunfight was raging. The three of us ran from the exposure of the lit tetragate and found shelter behind the nearest of the smaller blocks. Las shots wove in and out of the stone shapes, ricocheting and rebounding. "Titus! Gregor!" He was 20 meters away, a third of the way into the chamber, huddled behind a block and firing his las pistol at figures closer to the Necrochuk's resting place. I glimpsed Locke and 8 or 9 heretic troopers. I looked to either side of me at Bequin and Midas. "Choose your targets," I told them. We began to fire in support of Endor, dropping at least one of the heretics. As they reeled from the salvo, Endor leapt up and ran forward. A las shot clipped him and blew him back against a stone upright. I ran forward myself, firing my bolt pistol, which I had braced in both hands. I blew chunks from the blocks ahead of me, and hit at least one of the enemy gunners. I reached Endor. He was wounded in the chest. It would be fatal if we couldn't get him clear quickly. I pulled him into cover and waited while Bequin ran up through the rows to my side. "Pressure here," I said, showing her, my hands wet with my old friend's blood. She did as she was told. I became aware of thunderous noises from beyond the chamber. The place shook. More thunder rolled, and a section of the curved ceiling suddenly splintered and collapsed, cascading wreckage down, allowing cold exterior light to shaft in. A second later, 3 more holes ruptured and burst through the roof, and from outside I could hear the muffled hammering of bombardment. "Midas!" He was already moving up to my left, ditching his needle rifle for the pistols in the tight confines. Lethal Glavian needles hissed through the air. The ground continued to shake. A further section of roof came down. Leaving Endor with Bequin, I ducked from pillar to pillar, braving the deluge of shots. Midas and I switched to our earpiece links in Glossia. "Thorn ushers Aegis, a tempest sinister." "Aegis attending, tempest in 3. I counted the 3 beats and ran forward as Midas hurled his frag grenade to my left before opening fire with both pistols. The flash and bang of the blast obscured the bombardment outside for a moment. A heretic was flung upwards, limbs flailing, and glanced brokenly off a pillar before hitting the ground. Midas's tempest of covering confusion had allowed me to get within 10 meters of Locke. I could no longer see him, however. Keeping my grip on my bolt pistol, I drew my power sword in my left hand and came around the block. Locke and one of his men had chosen the exact same moment to plough forward into me. We broke from cover and came face to face in the narrow gap between pillars. My pistol's first shot missed the lunging Locke and tore the left arm off his accomplice. Before the wailing man had even hit the ground, Locke's las pistol had put a round through the meat of my right arm. A long-bladed dagger flashed forward in his other hand. We slammed into each other. I tried to sweep my power sword around, but it struck something, and Locke sidestepped. The basket hilt of his dagger smashed into my face and knocked me over onto my back. With a grin that he knew I could never copy, he raised his las pistol to fire down into my brain. 2 tons of Xenos quarried stone pillar sliced through at hip height by my power blade, crushed him into the flaking ground. I rose. Gorgone Locke was still alive. His belly and pelvis were smashed under the fallen pillar, and his arms were pinned. He gazed up at me through blinking, bewildered eyes. "Gorgone Locke, in the eyes of the Holy Inquisition, you are thrice damned by action, association, and belief," I said, beginning the catechism of abolition.
"No,"
he whispered. As I completed the exclamation, I cut the mark of heresy into the flesh of his brow with the tip of my sword. By the time I had finished, he was dead from his crush injuries. The shattering chamber still shook. On their long chains, the hooks swung. Dust and fragments dribbled down from the tears in the roof, falling through the bars of cold light. I reached down and found the pearl polyhedron in Locke's blood-soaked coat. The primer. I slipped it into my pocket and turned to see Midas approaching. "The last of his rats have fled," he said, holstering his pistols. He looked down at the dead shipmaster. "So perish all heretics, eh?" I reached up with one hand to take the Xenos Necrochuk from its shelf, and found myself unable to move. Some enormous psychic force froze me rigid. "So perish all heretics indeed," said a voice. "Turn him, so he can see me." Involuntarily, I swung round, my hand still raised in the act of reaching out. I saw Midas, also paralyzed and rigid. his dark features locked in a rictus of dismay. Conrad Molitor, my brother Inquisitor, was standing before me, smiling. His 3 hooded servants were at his side. "Such valor, Gregor! Such dedication! I thought you'd be the one to find the prize." I tried to answer, but my mouth refused to obey me. Spittle bubbled between my clenched teeth. Molitor looked around at his cowled companions. "Let him speak," he said. The psychic constraints on my voice slackened. Speech was still an effort.
What are you doing, Molitor?"
"Recovering the priceless Necrochuk, of course. We really can't have you destroying another copy now, can we?"
"We?"
"There are many who believe mankind will benefit more from the study of this artifact than from its destruction. I have come to safeguard those interests."
Rorken will never allow... You will burn for...
My estimable Lord Brother Rorken will never know. Feel how this place quakes. See how the roof splinters and collapses. 10 minutes ago, I signaled to the fleet that the primary objective was achieved. I gave the code for Sanction Extremis. They believe the Necrochuk had been found and safely disposed of. Our forces are withdrawing with all haste. The batteries of the fleet have begun to level these Xenos places. No one will know that the divine Necrochuk has been carried off safely. Not a shred of evidence will survive the bombardment. Not a shred of evidence. Nor any voice of dissent. His yellow-pupiled eyes regarded me. "How brave of you to give your life in the assault on 56 Izar. Your name will be remembered on the roll of honor. I assure you. I'll see to that myself."
"Bastard!"
I fought with my mind to break free, but it was impossible. This was not Molitor's hold on me. One of his retainers, or all 3 in concert, supremely powerful. "Fetch it for me," Molitor said to one of his men, gesturing to the Necrochuk with a wave of his checked sleeve. "We would be well to leave promptly." The hammering bombardment was now a perpetual shaking roar. The robed figure slid forward and took down the blue octahedron, cupping it in elegant, long-nailed fingers. He seemed to study it and looked round at Molitor. "It is useless," he said. "What?" "Unreadable. Locked within an impenetrable Xenos language code." Molitor stammered. "No! Impossible! Break the code!" "Would that I could. It is beyond even my ability." "There must be a means of translation." The hooded man holding the Necrochuk looked round at me. "He has a primer. The only primer. He's trying not to think about it, but I can see it in his mind. Look in his coat pocket." The smile returned to Molitor's face. He came close to me, reaching out a hand towards my coat. "Devious to the last, Gregor. You whoreson wretch!" A las round blew his hand off at the wrist. Molitor screamed and stumbled back, clutching his smoking stump. Bequin, her face pursed grimly, her las carbine at her shoulder and aimed at his heart, appeared beside me. "Kill them! Kill them!" Molitor screamed. I felt the immediate pressure of the psychic vice tightening to finish me. Then I reeled away, freed. The psychic blank of Bequin's untouchable nature shielded me now she was at my side. The servant holding the Necrochuk took a step backwards in surprise. Molitor, frantic with pain and anger, saw that his powerful psychic was thwarted somehow and yelled, "Albart! Albara! The hearts!" Code words. Trigger words. The pair of servants who had remained by his side sprang forward, their robes shredding away. Arco-flagellants. Heretics reprogrammed and rebuilt with augmetics and bionics to serve as murderous slaves. The trigger words woke them from their calming states of bliss and plunged them into maniacal rages. Out of their robes they were foul, hunched things, encrusted with crude surgical implants and sacred charms. Their hands were lashing clutches of electro-whips, their eyes dull, bulbous orbits under the rims of the tarnished pacifier helmets bolted to their skulls. Midas, Bequin, and I fired our weapons together, raking them with punishment as they charged forward. The damage they suffered was immense, but still they came on, their bodies pumped with intoxicating adrenal fluid, pain blockers and frenzy-inducing chemical stimulants. They didn't feel what we were doing to them. One was just an arm's length from me when my desperate rain of bolts finally defeated it. A shot exploded the armored matrix of chemical dispensers on its shoulder, spraying fluid into the air. In a second, it fell convulsing to the ground at our feet as the damage robbed it of its drug source and left nothing but agony behind. The other barely felt the punctures of Midas's 2 subtle needles. Frantically, we split to either side, out of its path. Braying and thrashing its whip limbs, it pounded after Midas, who ducked left and right between pillars, trying to evade it. Only his Glavian-bred grace and speed kept him out of its inexorably advancing grip. He knew he had seconds left. Bequin and I were moving, but there was precious little we could do. Midas pulled off his pouch of grenades, priming one as he twisted and sidestepped between the pillars, scarcely avoiding a withering lash of flexible metal whips that scored gouges in the stone. Midas feinted left and then threw himself directly at the beast, snagging the strap of his pouch around its neck as he vaulted over its shoulder head first. The grenades detonated in one stunning flash and atomized the ravening man-beast. Caught in the shockwave, Midas was thrown into a pillar and dropped unconscious. "Eisenhorn! Eisenhorn!" Molitor was wailing as he and his remaining servant hunted for me. His voice was cracking with pain and fury. "Stay at my side," I told Bequin as we ran deeper into the chamber. "That psychic can't touch me while I'm close to you." Half the ceiling and a significant part of the wall blew in. For a second the air was solid with billowing orange fire. Deafened, our skins scorched by the blast, Bequin and I were back on our feet in a moment. The chamber was open to the sky now, and cold white light poured in, heavy with smoke. "Come on!" Together we scrambled towards the blast-damaged wall, picking our way up the smouldering slope of broken stone and whatever material the Ceruthi used for construction. This material was fused and bubbling, like plastic or flesh. We headed for the light. We emerged high on the curving upper face of the Ceruthi edifice. It was cold, and the wind that came across the segmented ridges of the polished white roof was brisk and full of the odors of smoke, physaline, and promethium. We were at a dizzying height. The pearly flanks of the vast structure arced away to a ground far below, and the surface was hard and polished, like ice. Bequin slipped, and I managed to grab her before she slid away down the curve. From up here, high in the alien sky, we could see across the lakes of fire and the vast smoke banks that roiled away for hundreds of kilometers. We could see flocks of troop ships soaring up and away through the smoke cover towards the parent ships in orbit. On the flats of white mud far beneath us, Imperial troops ran to waiting dropships, discarding packs and helmets and even weapons in their haste to leave. Tanks and armored carriers wallowed and puffed through the wet mud and up onto the tongue-like ramps of heavy lifters. Shells and lasfire flickered across the lakes and mud as the remaining heretic forces fought on heedless. Lances and forks of dazzling energy bit down from the clouds, murdering the landscape. Obeying Molitor's instructions to the letter, Admiral Spatian was leveling the area. All 5 of us Inquisitors, along with Signwolf and Key Deathwatch, and selected officers of the invasion force, had been given the code words to unleash this doom. Molitor had sealed our fate. Once given, Sanction Extremis could not be revoked, even if my Vox had been working, instead of crippled by the electromagnetic bursts that accompanied every orbital strike. As per the battle plans, Spatian was systematically wasting the invasion site as fast as possible, even at the cost of his own retreating ground forces. Another Ceruthi edifice, 20 kilometers away, died. Shaped in a form that suggested a nautilus shell, its opalescent curves were cracked and split by blue-hot heavy lasers. The dye-straight beams came down through the clouds from ships so far up they were invisible, and tore through the edifice like testamental judgment. Waves of fighter bombers swept in, sowing payloads of munitions that bloomed in rippling seas of explosions. Guided warheads, sleek like airborne sharks, whined overhead on the last stage of their first and final journey from starship to target. The edifice ruptured and blew out. Light shock lit the hemisphere. A towering column of white ash smoke rose, folding into a 15-kilometer torus-shaped cloud. The sight was stunning, shocking. Bequin and I gazed at it. A few heartbeats later, it was repeated behind us, 40 kilometers distant, as another Ceruthi edifice was annihilated. The edifice on whose smoothly curving upper surfaces we now stood was undoubtedly going to go the same way soon. Even now I knew the coordinates were being loaded into the fleet's gunnery servitors. We ran along the lip of another curved segment. Afterburners red against the black smoke, more dropships came in, heading towards cheering, gesticulating huddles of Mirepoix infantry out on the flats. I was astounded at the selfless courage of the dropship crews. Spacian's bombardment wasn't waiting for them to move in and pull out. They were risking everything to make the surface run and retrieve as many troopers as they could. "Gregor!" Beckwin shouted in my ear. I turned. Down the shell-formed span of the roof behind us, Molitor and his henchmen had appeared out of the blast hole. Unsteady, they scrambled up after us. A las shot whined past me, kissing the pearly surface and leaving a burn scar. "The primer, you whoreson bastard! Give me the primer!" Molitor yelled. I gave him a full clip of bolt rounds instead. The first of the thundering tracer shots splintered chunks out of the edifice roof. Then I hit and exploded his left thigh, his belly, and his throat. Conrad Molitor bucked and twitched as the rounds tore through him, and then fell. His mauled body slid down the curve of the roof and disappeared, leaving a smear of blood behind it. His henchman advanced, heedless of the shots, throwing off his hooded robe. He was naked beneath it, tall, well-muscled, with a golden cast to his skin. His face was handsome, and tiny residual horns sprouted from his skull. His eyes were blank. My prophetic dreams were made flesh. Terror seized me, turned my heart inside out. Chapter 26. Cherubael. The Brink. Exterminatus. The blank-eyed man, though in truth he was not a man, but a demon in human form, strode up the shining curve towards me. The glowing octahedron of the Ceruthi's unholy text was clasped in one nimble hand.
"I would like the primer now, please, Gregor."
"What are you?"
"This is no place for introductions."
He gestured about himself. Lances of annihilation blasted down into the mudflats nearby. "Humor me," I managed.
"Very well. My name is Cherubael. Now, that primer. Time is ticking away."
"Time will always tick away," I said. "Who made you?"
"Made me?"
The blank-eyed man smiled at me duplicitously. "You're a demon host, a conjured thing. Tell me who made you and who commanded you and Molitor to come after this prize, and I might give you the primer." He laughed and licked his thin lips with a glossy, forked tongue.
"Let us both be abundantly clear about this, Gregor. You will give me the primer. Either you will hand me the primer now, or I will come over to you and take it, and break every bone in your body, and defile that girl at your side, and break every bone in her body too, and then drag your jiggling carcasses down into the chamber below, and string you both up on the hooks, and burn out your agony centers as I wait for the bombardment to flatten this place."
He paused.
"Your choice."
"You've been in my dreams for a long while now. Why is that?" I pressed.
"You are gifted, Gregor, and time is not the arrow that humans like to think it is. A second in the warp would show you that. Why, a second in the four-dimensional habitats of the Ceruthi should have proved it too. Your dreams were just nightmares of something yet to happen."
"Who made you?" My voice was insistent. His answer was the one I least expected, and it left me all but stunned.
"The Holy Inquisition made me, Gregor. A brother of yours made me. Now, for the last time, give me that."
The demon host swung around suddenly as voices called out from lower down the roof. Brother Captain Seinwolf was clambering up out of the blast hole, flanked by Midas and another Death Watcher carrying the limp form of Titus Endor. Seinwolf raised his storm bolter and fired at the blank-eyed man. Cherubael reached out and caught the glowing shells, plucking them out of the air.
"Go home, Astartes bastard,"
he yelled down the sloping roof at Seinwolf.
"This has nothing to do with you."
The fiend came up the ridge until he was facing me. I could see the tiny arcs of power darting across his glowing skin. I could smell the stink of corruption. Eye to eye now. He held out his hand, palm up, fingernails long and polished like claws. Clever of you to find it untouchable to cancel me out. He looked over at Bequin. How did you manage that? Fate, like time, is not linear, Cherubeo. Surely you know that. I found Bequin in the same way that the dreams of you found me. He nodded. I like you, Xenos Eisenhorn. So very challenging and stimulating for a human. I wish we had leisure to discourse and break bread, but we haven't, he snapped suddenly. Give me the primer. I took out the polyhedron. His smile broadened. I dropped the artifact onto the silky roof, and, before it could slide away, crushed it under the heel of my boot. The demon host took a step backwards, gazing down at the crunched dust. He looked up at me again with his blank eyes. You are a man of singular dedication, Gregor. I would have enjoyed killing you when the day and hour came. But you're dead already. This edifice is 240 seconds away from destruction. Cherish this. He tossed me the Xenos Necrochuk, and I caught it in one gloved hand. You've won. Take that consolation to the afterlife. He started to run towards the lip of the roof, and then threw himself out in a perfect dive, arms raised. For a moment he hung in space. Then he forked his body in, executed a precise roll, and disappeared into the lake of fire below. I pulled Bequin to me as Signwolf, Midas, and the other Death Watch Marine approached. Endor, crumpled in the Astartes' arms, looked dead. I prayed he was, for in a moment this place would dissolve in fire. Rosethorn from Aegis above, and, well, above for Emperor's sake. Damn this glossier crap. Move! My gun cutter swung in over the edifice roof, ramp jaws open. I could see Fishig at the helm through the cockpit screens, yelling at me. Amos was at his side. I watched 56 Izar die from the bridge of the St. Sidus as we left orbit. Petals of flame the size of continents spread out under its milky skin. Sanction extremis. Exterminatus. After the deluge of fire, the virus bombs, the seething storms of tailored plagues, the nuclear atrocity. It was a cinder by the time we left. No contact with the Saruthi race was ever made again. And the tainted, glowing light of the Necrochuk was extinguished forever.
Gotta get moving.
Epilogue. At Pamafree. At Pamafree we rested. 40 weeks of voyage through the Immaterium had dulled our sense of victory. The fleet dispersed at Thracian Primaris, and the last I saw of Sergeant Yaros was a waving hand across a smoky, beery bar. I rented a villa out by the Sound at Pamafree. Midas slept most of the day, and whiled away the night in games of regicide with Amos and Fishig. Bequin bathed in the sun and swam in the breakers. I sat out on the salt-whipped stoop and watched over the beach like a god who has forgotten his creations. Great labours still awaited us. Reports to be made, interviews and debriefings to be attended. Lord Rawkin had called for a tribunal of inquiry, and the High Lords of Terra were awaiting a full account of the matter. Months of paperwork, hearings and evidential audits lay ahead. The identity of the force behind Molitor and his demon host remained a mystery, and though Lord Rawkin was as anxious as myself to find an answer, I doubted any would readily emerge. The question might fester and stagnate, unanswered, in the slow, unwieldy bureaucracy of the Inquisition for years. I would not allow that. As soon as I was free to engage upon another case, I would dedicate myself to finding Cherubael's master. The beloved rule of man had come close to great calamity, thanks to his scheming. I would not forget the Saruthi. They were an object lesson, if any were truly needed, of how an entire advanced culture might be consumed by chaos.
I didn't ask for this.
Seabirds looped in the gusting tide wind. The breakers crashed. The blank-eyed man still haunted my dreams. After echoes, or ripples of the future? I would have to wait and see. That was Eisenhorn, Xenos, by Dan Abbott. Read by Toby Longworth. This recording is copyrighted to Games Workshop 2016. By order of His Most Holy Majesty the God Emperor of Terra, sequestered inquisitorial dossiers, authorized persons only. Case file 112:67B:AA6:XAD. Please enter your authority code. Validating. Thank you, Inquisitor. You may proceed. Verbal transcript of PICT recorded document. Location: Maginor. Date: 239M41. Recovered from Servitor recording module. Transcribed by Savant Eledix. Ordo Hereticus Inquisitorial Data Library Faculty, Phibos Secundus, 240M41. PICT record white noise segues to darkness, sounds of distant human pain, a flash of light, pos las fire, sounds of running. PICT source moves, tracking, vibrating, some stone walls in close focus, another flash, brighter, closer, squeal of pain, source unknown, an extremely bright flash, loss of picture, image indistinct for 2 minutes 38 seconds, some background noise. A man, subject 1, in long robes, calls out as he strides past close to the PICT source, speech unrecoverable. Surroundings, dark stone, pos tunnel, tomb. One's identity unknown, partial face view only. PICT source moves in close behind 1, observing as 1 draws a force hammer from a thigh loop under his robe. Close up on 1's hands as he grips haft. Inquisitorial signet ring in plain view. 1 turns, face obscured by shadow. 1 speaks. Voice 1. Move in, in the name of all that's holy. Come on and... Words obliterated by sound flash. Bastard monster to death! Further flashes of light, now clearly close las impacts. PICT source filters fail to block glare. Whiteout. Image whiteout for 0 minutes 14 seconds. Resolution slowly returning. Passing in through the high stone entrance of some considerable chamber. Grey stone, rough hewn. PICT source pans. Bodies in doorway, and also slumped down interior steps. Massive injuries, mangled. Stones wet with blood. Voice off. 1. Where are you? Where are you? Show yourself. PICT source moves in. 2 human shapes move past it to left, blurred. Image stall reveals 1, subject 2, to be male, approx 40 years, heavy set, wearing Imperial Guard issue body plate, no insignia or idents. Significant facial scarring, old. Wielding belt-fed heavy stubber. Other, subject 3, is female, approx 25 years, svelte, skin dyed blue, tattoos and body glove armor of a Morituri death cultist initiate, wielding force blade, approx 45 centimeters length. Blurred shapes 2 and 3 move beyond PICT source. PICT source pans round, establishing sidelong view of 2 and 3 engaged in rapid hand-to-hand warfare with adversaries on lower steps. Adversaries are heterogeneous mix. 6 humans with surgical bionic implants, 2 mutants, 3 offensive servitors. See attached file record for stall frame details. 2 fires heavy stubber, soundtrack distorts. 2 human adversaries pulped. Backwash smoke haze renders image partially indistinct. 3 severs head of mutant. Vaults backwards. Transcriptional assumption. PICT source too slow to follow. And impales human adversary. PICT source moves down. Image jerky. Voice off. Manisha, to the left, to the... PICT source makes partial capture as 3 is hit repeatedly by energy fire. 3 convulses. Explodes. PICT source hit by blood mist. Image fogs. Image wiped clear. 2 is yelling, moving ahead out of view, firing heavy stubber. Sudden crossfire laser effect. Las flare blinds PICT source optics. Various noise sources. Indistinct voices. Some screaming. Image returns. 1 is just ahead of PICT source. Charging into wide flat chamber lit by green chemical lamps. Face illuminated by light for 0.3 seconds. Subject 1 positively identified as Inquisitor Hetris Lugenbrow. Lugenbrow.
Quicksos! Quicksos! I put it all to the sword and the cleansing flame. Now you monster! Now you bastard!
Voice unidentified.
I am here, Lugenbrow. Karnagar awaits.
Lugenbrow 1 moves off image. Pict source pans. Image jerky. Body parts scattered on chamber floor. Composite identifies subject 2 as one of 9 corpses. Major detonations nearby. Image shakes. Pict source falls sidelong. Image blank for 1 minute, 7 seconds. Significant background noise. Image returns. Lugenbrow partly visible off frame left. Engaged in combat. Afterglow residue of force hammer blows remain burned on image for several seconds. Image indistinct. Pict source turns to focus on Lugenbrow. Lugenbrow engaged in hand-to-hand combat with unknown foe. Movements too fast for Pict source to capture. Blur. Human figures. Identity unknown. Pos adversary troops. Move in from right frame. Heads of human figures explode. Figures topple. Whiteout. Pict source blanked. Duration unknown. Image returns. Imperfect. Jerky shots of ground and wall. Refocus blurring. Pict source reacquires Lugenbrow, an adversary in combat. Smoke fumes haze view. Combat as before too rapid for Pict source to capture. Extensive background noise. Glowing line, believed to be blade weapon, impales Lugenbrow. Image shakes. Some picture loss. Lugenbrow immolates. Image burns out. Pause, pict blank of unknown duration. Image returns. Close-up of face looking into pict source. Identity unknown. Subject 4. 4 is handsome, sculptural, smiling. Eyes blank. Voice 4.
Hello, little thing. I am Cherubeo.
Light flash. Scream, believed to originate from pict source. Image out. Recording ends.
Audible hopes you've enjoyed this program.